I come from a country where cities are museums. Hong Kong is very different. Space is very expensive in Hong Kong. The city is blocked on one side by the mountains and the sea on the other side. So pressured by the need to expand and without space to do it, historical low-rise buildings are often not worth a lot, especially in the city center. During the second half of the 20th century, most of them have been demolished. The Hong Kong Club was built in 1897 by Palmer and Turner, and it has a really rare Victorian style that you cannot really see in Hong Kong anymore. It was and it is today the major meeting point for government officials and heads of major trading firms. But after 80 years of use, it was too expensive to maintain and it was demolished. This is what the Hong Kong Club looks like today. Since the 70s, the government, activist organizations are trying to save what is left. The Antiquities Advisory Board created a ranking from 3 to 1 to rate historical building, 1 being the highest rank of reservation. Another example is the Hotun Garden. This villa was built in the 1930s on Victoria Peak. It was declared a Grade 1 historical building in 2011. Unfortunately, despite its grade, it was destroyed in 2013 by the owner and sold for over 500 million euros in order to build residential buildings.
The land at the peak went for $5.1 billion in a deal brokered by Savills.
Many others suffered the same fate. The old HSBC building,
The Hong Kong Shanghai Bank was founded back in the days of pirates and opium barons.
the General Post Office, and more recently the Tung Tak pawn shop. The problem with those historical buildings is that they have no more use. They are expensive to maintain and most of them are abandoned. So in order to save them, they have to find a way to give them a second life. One way to do that is to renovate them and change the use of it. It is called adaptive reuse. Look at this building, isn't it so cute? It is the F11 Museum. Originally a residential building, it has been a household shop, a restaurant, a supermarket. It is now the first privately owned photo gallery in Hong Kong. It is the last remnant of this Art Deco style row house built in the 1930s in Hong Kong. It was declared a Grade 3 historical building. Since Sir Douglas renovated it with his wife in 2012, the museum is hosting a lot of books and rare cameras. An exhibition of really famous photographers have taken place there. So by doing this, Sir Douglas is hoping that it will encourage other private entrepreneurs to conserve historical buildings. Another example is the Louis Sanshun Chinese Medical Clinic. It is very typical from the second half of the 19th century. The name of this type of architecture is called Tong. There are buildings designed for commercial use on the ground floor and apartments on the upper floors. They are characterized by their balcony and columns that protect the pedestrian from the heat and the rain. After the 1960s, many Tonglo were demolished to give way to commercial buildings and taller apartments. This building became deserted until the year 2000, when it was declared a Grade 1 historical building. At that period, the government recovered the building and decided to renovate it. The goal of the government was to revitalize its heritage and make it a hub for culture. So what they did is that they revitalized the place as a Chinese medical center as it was before, but they also permitted to tourists like me, for example, to learn about this kind of medicine and visit the place. So the Louis Sanshun Clinic is a very good example and very successful of revitalization. Unfortunately, revitalization or renovation often don't make sense, as it is much more lucrative to build apartment buildings or offices in the same plot of land. This loss of heritage might not be an issue for big companies, but it is a huge problem for current and future generations of Hong Kongers. In order to know more about this topic, I went to meet a local guide, Army.
So Hong Kong is really a fast-paced city. You know, construction happens every day and you definitely see high rises. So now these buildings are getting higher and higher. The highest one in Hong Kong is 884 meter high. So that has to be the newest one. But in my daily life, I witness a lot of changes. For example, I'm a grassroots boy. My father was a former refugee from China, and after he arrived in Hong Kong in 1978, he worked everywhere. Eventually, he worked in a wet market as a butcher. Nowadays, I think we are not just losing old buildings, but the old facility has been rebranded as well. So now we have more of these rebranded shopping mall instead of old facilities like wet market. In Hong Kong, there's a big problem of our identity. We cannot really explain who we are, or maybe sometimes when people come to Hong Kong, they're confused what we are, who we are. That makes sense because Hong Kong was a British colony, but after all, it was Chinese people living in this city. Well, I mean, most of them, we are Chinese. So we used to be British. Of course, it takes a long time for us to buy the idea that we are actually living under British government control. But once we buy it, we feel like we took pride in it. But after 1997, Hong Kong has become part of China. So, it's time for Chinese people to come home. But interestingly, in that moment, so many of us were so afraid of the future. So eventually, 10% of the population moved to other countries. So it looks like we don't really like being Chinese. So that's a very complicated question. Culturally, we are Chinese. In terms of ethnicity, we are Chinese. But politically, it's hard to answer. Most of us would say we are Hong Konger, but more and more of us are buying the idea that we are Chinese people. As one community, as one society, we got to share some common stories. Otherwise, we won't be one person. So the story all took place in these buildings, all the historical buildings. So when the buildings are there, we can still tell the story. But if they are no longer there, then we can no longer tell the story. So old buildings is where we can visit and really trace back to the roots of our culture, and there we can get to understand what life used to be like for the older generation. That would be a very important sign or symbol for us to believe that we are one people, and that really forms our sense of identity.
Hong Kong has a complex history, a mix of different culture, and its architecture is a way to remember it and to understand it. So this was my last video in Hong Kong. I hope you liked it. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, share it. I am right now living in Bangladesh. I'm packing at the moment. I'm going to Delhi, India. As I'm always on the road, I'm editing 1 month after I film the video. I am also going to start a podcast. I do a lot of interviews and I realize that in the videos that I do, I only use a few seconds of it. So I'm doing this podcast to share with you the full interviews so you can listen to it. So see you next week.